On a quiet summer morning, June 12, 2022, the picturesque suburban streets of Brentwood, Tennessee, were shattered by a chilling discovery. The Carter family home, a stately brick house nestled on a manicured cul-de-sac, became the scene of an unimaginable tragedy. James Carter, a respected businessman in his early 40s, lay lifeless on the living room floor. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the pristine beige carpet, while a blunt object, a shattered brass lamp, lay nearby, its jagged edges glinting ominously in the soft morning light. The first responders arrived to find Samantha Carter, James's wife, in the driveway, her face streaked with tears and panic. Dressed in a simple nightgown, she clutched her chest, gasping as neighbors gathered behind the yellow tape that cordoned off the scene. "He's gone," she screamed, her voice cracking under the weight of the horrific reality. She claimed to have woken up to the sound of breaking glass, only to discover her husband lying in a pool of blood and an intruder fleeing through the back door. The police moved quickly, securing the area and beginning their meticulous search for evidence. The signs of a struggle were undeniable: overturned furniture, broken picture frames, and scuff marks on the wooden floor. But something about the scene felt off. The entry point, a smashed window near the kitchen, appeared staged, with glass shards scattered unnaturally. Detectives exchanged uneasy glances as they documented every detail. Samantha, barely coherent, was escorted to the back of an ambulance for evaluation. "He was everything to me," she whispered to the paramedic, her voice trembling. "I don't understand how this could happen here." Her grief seemed genuine, yet to the trained eyes of Detective Laura Mills, something felt rehearsed, too deliberate, too calculated. As the investigation unfolded, neighbors shared accounts that raised more questions than answers. Mrs. Abernathy, the elderly widow next door, mentioned hearing a loud argument coming from the Carter home the previous evening. "I thought it was just another marital spat," she admitted, guilt etched across her face. Another neighbor recalled seeing a car parked a few houses down late that night, though they couldn't identify the driver. By mid-morning, the small community was abuzz with rumors. Brentwood was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where the biggest scandal might involve a teenager sneaking out past curfew. Now, it was the epicenter of a gruesome murder. James Carter's reputation as a hard-working family man only deepened the mystery. A rising star in the local business community, he was known for his charitable work and dedication to his family. The idea of someone harboring a grudge against him seemed unthinkable. As the sun climbed higher, casting harsh light on the chaos below, Detective Mills stood in the Carter living room, her sharp gaze scanning the scene. Her instincts told her that this wasn't a random act of violence. Somewhere beneath the surface lay a web of secrets waiting to be unraveled. And Samantha Carter? She might hold the key to it all. Just a few months before the tragic morning of June 12, 2022, the Carter family appeared to have it all. Their Brentwood home, with its elegant landscaping and warm, inviting decor, reflected a life of stability and success. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form, cracks no one outside their walls could see. Samantha Carter was the epitome of a suburban homemaker. In her mid-30s, she carried an effortless grace that belied the exhaustion behind her ever-present smile. Her days revolved around managing the household, shuttling the children to school and extracurriculars, and maintaining the pristine image of a supportive wife. Yet Samantha felt trapped. Years of putting her family first had taken their toll, leaving her with an aching sense of invisibility. James Carter, her husband, was a man who commanded respect in both his professional and personal life. In his early 40s, James was a rising star in the local business community, known for his sharp instincts and unyielding work ethic. But his ambition often meant long hours at the office or extended business trips, like the one he'd taken to Atlanta just weeks before the murder. He justified his absences as necessary sacrifices for their future. "It's all for you and the kids," he would say, brushing off Samantha's pleas for more time together. Their marriage, once filled with warmth and laughter, had grown cold. Nights that had once been spent curled up on the couch were now spent in separate rooms, James immersed in emails and Samantha scrolling through social media, searching for a connection she could no longer find at home. Arguments flared more often, though they rarely resolved anything. Samantha felt she was speaking into a void, her words bouncing off the walls instead of reaching her husband. Amid this growing isolation, Samantha began seeking solace in unexpected places. She started attending services at St. Michael's Church, a modest yet picturesque sanctuary nestled in Brentwood. The church was a hub of the community, known for its compassionate leader, Father David Harper. Father David, a charismatic priest in his late 40s, had long been a pillar of support for the residents of Brentwood. His sermons resonated deeply, blending moral guidance with an approachable warmth. Parishioners admired his ability to make each person feel seen and valued. But even Father David carried a burden no one could see. Behind his composed exterior lay a man grappling with doubts about his faith and the growing weight of his responsibilities. When Samantha met Father David after a service in early January 2022, she was immediately drawn to his calming presence. Their initial exchanges were polite and formal. Samantha shared her struggles as a wife and mother, and Father David offered words of encouragement. But over the weeks, their conversations grew more personal. Samantha found herself confiding in him about her loneliness and her frustrations with James. In Father David, she discovered something she hadn't felt in years: validation. Father David, in turn, was captivated by Samantha's vulnerability. Her honesty struck a chord within him, awakening feelings he had long suppressed. While he rationalized his growing attachment as mere compassion, a quiet part of him knew it was something more. By March 2022, Samantha's visits to St. Michael's had become a regular escape. She attended not just Sunday services but midweek gatherings, often lingering afterward to speak with Father David. James, preoccupied with work, noticed her increased absences but dismissed them as harmless. He had no reason to suspect that his wife's time at church was becoming the foundation of something dangerous. In the Carter household, the facade of normalcy continued. Friends and neighbors saw Samantha as the doting wife and James as the hard-working provider. Yet inside the home, the emotional distance between them widened with each passing day. Samantha's once bright laughter became a rare sound, and James's attempts to engage often felt like too little, too late. As spring turned to summer, the fragile balance of their lives teetered on the edge of collapse. Samantha had found a confidant in Father David, and James was too distracted by his career to notice the storm brewing under his roof. For Samantha, St. Michael's was no longer just a church, it was a sanctuary. For Father David, Samantha was no longer just a parishioner, she was a temptation. And for James, the warning signs were there, but he was too focused on his work to see the tragedy barreling toward his family. By early spring 2022, Samantha Carter's visits to St. Michael's Church had become more than a spiritual routine, they were a lifeline. Inside the hallowed walls of the church, she felt a reprieve from the monotony and emotional void of her life at home. And at the center of that solace was Father David Harper. What began as moments of quiet reflection and polite conversation evolved into something far deeper and far more dangerous. Samantha found herself drawn to Father David in ways she couldn't explain, or didn't want to admit. He listened intently when she spoke, his piercing blue eyes reflecting an understanding she hadn't felt in years. Unlike James, who often dismissed her concerns or brushed off her emotions, Father David made her feel heard, valued, and seen. She began sharing parts of herself she hadn't shared with anyone, not even her closest friends. Her struggles as a wife and mother, her feelings of being trapped in a life she no longer recognized, and her longing for something more. Father David's response was always gentle and compassionate. He offered words of encouragement, scripture to reflect upon, and reassurance that she was not alone. But with each conversation, a line blurred. His role as a spiritual guide began to shift into something more intimate. He started anticipating her visits, his heart quickening whenever he saw her approach the church doors. His vows, promises he had upheld for decades, now felt like shackles, binding him to a life that denied him the connection he craved. Samantha's vulnerability awakened something in Father David he had long buried. Beneath his calm demeanor and carefully crafted image of piety was a man who had yearned for companionship. For years, he had convinced himself that his role as a priest was enough, that his life's purpose was to serve others and remain detached. But Samantha shattered that illusion. Her beauty, her fragility, and the raw honesty in her confessions stirred feelings he could no longer suppress. By late March, their conversations moved beyond the confines of the confessional booth and into the private corners of the church. Samantha began staying late after services, the two of them talking for hours in the dim light of the sanctuary. Their topics ranged from faith to philosophy to the ache of unmet desires. Father David offered solace, and Samantha, in turn, provided him a sense of purpose that extended beyond his duties as a priest. Still, both wrestled with the weight of their actions. Samantha knew she was crossing a boundary, but the warmth she felt in Father David's presence was intoxicating. She told herself it was harmless, that their connection was purely emotional, not physical. But deep down, she knew better. The way his hand lingered on hers during a moment of comfort, the way their gazes locked for just a second too long, these weren't the gestures of a priest and his parishioner. They were the unspoken language of two people who had stepped onto forbidden ground. For Father David, the guilt was overwhelming. His faith had always been his anchor, but now it felt like a chain pulling him under. Every sermon he delivered about morality and devotion felt like a lie. Every prayer he uttered was laced with the bitter irony of his own failings. Yet, even as the guilt gnawed at him, he couldn't bring himself to stop. Samantha was a beacon in his otherwise lonely existence, a reminder that he was still human, and fallible. As the weeks went on, their bond deepened. Samantha began fabricating reasons to leave the house, telling James she was volunteering at the church or attending evening prayer sessions. James, preoccupied with work, barely questioned her sudden devotion. The emotional chasm between them grew wider, leaving Samantha feeling justified in seeking comfort elsewhere. But what began as solace soon became dependency. Samantha found herself yearning for Father David's presence, replaying their conversations in her mind late at night. Father David, too, became consumed by thoughts of her, his once disciplined mind now wandering during Mass and prayer. Both knew they were treading dangerous waters, yet neither could resist the pull of their growing connection. By the time April arrived, their relationship had reached a tipping point. What had started as innocent conversations had become an emotional affair, one built on shared loneliness and mutual understanding but teetering on the edge of something far darker. Neither Samantha nor Father David could predict the storm their bond would unleash, but deep down, both sensed it was coming. And yet, they chose to stay on the path, unable, or unwilling, to turn back. By the time spring turned to May 2022, the Carter household had become a battleground of silent resentments and unspoken truths. The emotional distance between James and Samantha Carter, once a subtle undercurrent, now surged like a riptide threatening to pull them under. Each passing day brought new cracks to their already fragile marriage. James had always been a man of routine. He rose early, often before dawn, and returned home long after the sun had set, carrying the weight of his business ventures like an invisible armor. His dedication to providing for his family was unyielding, but it came at a cost he was unwilling, or unable, to acknowledge. The man who once surprised Samantha with breakfast in bed or spontaneous weekend getaways was now a ghost, present in body but absent in spirit. Samantha, meanwhile, had become a shadow of her former self. The vibrant, engaging woman James had married seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone withdrawn and distant. She no longer greeted him at the door with a warm smile or asked about his day. Instead, her focus was elsewhere, on her secret meetings with Father David Harper and the intoxicating solace she found within the walls of St. Michael's Church. At first, James had chalked up Samantha's changes to the pressures of managing the household. He reasoned that her increased visits to the church were a healthy outlet, a way for her to find community and support. But as the weeks passed, his unease grew. Samantha's absences became more frequent, her explanations increasingly vague. She would claim she was attending evening services or helping with church events, yet she often returned home late, her demeanor guarded. One evening in mid-May, James noticed something that shifted his suspicion into overdrive. As Samantha prepared for one of her supposed church outings, she received a text message. The screen lit up with a notification, and though she quickly turned the phone face down, James caught a glimpse of the sender, a number saved as D. Curiosity turned to paranoia. James began paying closer attention, cataloging Samantha's behavior in his mind like a businessman analyzing a quarterly report. He noticed how she avoided his gaze during conversations, how she deflected questions about her day, and how her laughter, a sound he hadn't heard in months, seemed reserved for someone else. The breaking point came one Saturday night. Samantha had been out for hours, claiming she was attending a late-night prayer vigil. When she finally walked through the door, her hair slightly disheveled and her demeanor unusually tense, James confronted her. "Where were you, Sam?" he asked, his tone calm but his eyes piercing. "I told you, James." "At the church," she replied, her voice steady, though her hands trembled as she placed her bag on the counter. "For 5 hours? At a church vigil?" His skepticism was thinly veiled, the words laced with a quiet anger that sent a chill down Samantha's spine. "Yes," she said firmly, meeting his gaze for the first time in what felt like weeks. "Why are you questioning me?" "Because you've been distant, Samantha. You've been lying about where you're going, about what you're doing." "I'm not blind." Her defensive walls shot up instantly. "I don't have to justify myself to you, James. Maybe if you paid more attention to this family instead of your work, you wouldn't feel the need to play detective." The accusation stung, but James refused to back down. "This isn't about my work. This is about you. About us. Something is going on, and I deserve to know what it is." Samantha turned away, biting back tears. She couldn't tell him the truth, not about Father David, not about the bond that had become her escape. "I'm just overwhelmed," she said finally, her voice softening. "The kids, the house, everything. I go to the church to clear my head, that's all." James wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust that her words were genuine. But the nagging voice in the back of his mind wouldn't let go. That night, as Samantha slept soundly beside him, he made a decision: he would uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Over the next few days, James began taking matters into his own hands. He checked Samantha's phone when she wasn't looking, scrolling through her messages for anything out of the ordinary. He noticed a series of texts to the same number, D, but they were cryptic, short phrases like, "We'll talk later," or, "I need to see you." Frustrated but undeterred, he decided to hire a private investigator. Unknown to Samantha, her carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. Every missed family dinner, every late-night outing, and every evasion of James's questions was another thread unraveling the delicate fabric of their marriage. And James, once too consumed by work to notice, was now fully alert to the storm brewing beneath their roof. The walls of the Carter household, once a sanctuary, now felt suffocating. Tensions hung heavy in the air, each interaction charged with suspicion and resentment. Neither James nor Samantha could have predicted how far their actions would spiral, nor the devastating consequences that lay ahead. But one thing was certain: the Carter family's idyllic life was on the brink of collapse. And the fallout would change everything. By the end of May 2022, the emotional storm that had been brewing in the Carter household spilled over into darker, more dangerous territory. Samantha Carter, trapped between her crumbling marriage and her growing dependency on Father David Harper, found herself in a spiral of confusion and desperation. Meanwhile, Father David, now fully aware of the risk their relationship posed, began to manipulate Samantha in ways that would seal their fates. It began subtly. Father David sensed Samantha's vulnerability and played on her fears, presenting himself as her sole source of solace. "You deserve happiness, Samantha," he told her one late evening during a clandestine meeting in his private study at St. Michael's Church. "James doesn't see you, he doesn't value you. But I do." His words, cloaked in compassion, carried an undercurrent of calculation. Father David was no longer merely comforting a troubled parishioner, he was steering her toward decisions she might never have considered on her own. As Samantha's visits to the church grew more frequent, so did their private conversations. Over the weeks, those discussions took on a more sinister tone. Father David began planting the seeds of doubt about James's intentions. He suggested that James's growing suspicions and controlling behavior were not just signs of a troubled marriage but potential threats to her safety and future. "He's watching you," Father David warned one night, his voice low and urgent. "Do you think he'd let you go without a fight? Men like James don't just walk away. He'll destroy you if he finds out the truth." Samantha's heart pounded at his words. The idea of James turning vengeful terrified her, though no such evidence existed. But Father David's calm authority and Samantha's growing dependence on him made her believe his every word. He painted James as a villain, twisting ordinary arguments and moments of tension into something far more menacing. By early June, Father David began suggesting what he called the inevitable solution. At first, he framed it as a theoretical idea, almost as if testing the waters. "What if James weren't in the picture anymore?" he asked one evening, his tone deceptively casual. Samantha recoiled at the suggestion, her eyes wide with shock. "I can't, no, I couldn't," she stammered, backing away as if the very thought were physically repulsive. "I'm not saying you should," Father David quickly replied, softening his voice. "But think about it, Samantha. He's suffocating you, keeping you trapped in a life you hate. How much longer can you endure this?" Samantha's resistance wavered over the following days. Her guilt and fear wrestled with the toxic allure of freedom that Father David dangled before her. Each time she voiced her doubts, he countered with reassurances, convincing her that she had no other choice. "This isn't just about you," he said. "It's about your future, your happiness. Don't you deserve that?" The final plan came together under the guise of practicality. Father David, leveraging his knowledge of crime from years of pastoral counseling, devised a scenario that he believed would leave no trace of their involvement. The murder would be staged as a botched burglary. Samantha would provide an alibi, ensuring she wasn't home when the crime took place. Father David, disguised in dark clothing and gloves, would handle the rest. The chosen night was June 11, 2022. Samantha, trembling with both dread and anticipation, told James she needed to meet a friend for dinner. She made sure to create a plausible story, one that would withstand scrutiny if questioned later. "Don't wait up," she told him, forcing a smile as she kissed his cheek. James, unaware of the storm about to descend, nodded distractedly, his focus already on his laptop. As the clock struck midnight, Father David entered the Carter home through the back door, which Samantha had deliberately left unlocked. The house was eerily silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. James, sitting in the living room with a glass of bourbon, barely had time to react before Father David struck. The struggle was brief but violent. The brass lamp shattered as it connected with James's skull, the room descending into chaos. Father David worked quickly, scattering valuables and smashing a window to make it appear as though a burglar had panicked and fled. He left no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing to tie him or Samantha to the scene. When Samantha returned home in the early hours of June 12, she found the staged crime scene exactly as planned. But seeing James's lifeless body in the dim light of the living room was a shock she hadn't fully prepared for. Her breath hitched as she fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face, not out of love for her husband, but from the crushing weight of what she had done. Gripping her phone, she dialed 911, her voice trembling with rehearsed panic. "Help," she cried. "My husband, he's been attacked. There was a break-in. I think he's dead." As sirens wailed in the distance, Samantha played her part, clutching her chest and sobbing into the phone. Meanwhile, Father David waited in the shadows, confident that their plan had succeeded. But neither could predict how quickly their carefully constructed lies would begin to unravel. The truth, as it often does, had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. The morning of June 12, 2022, brought chaos and heartbreak to the quiet streets of Brentwood, Tennessee. While neighbors whispered behind yellow police tape, officers meticulously combed through the Carter home, their trained eyes catching every out-of-place detail. Initially, the scene painted a picture of a burglary gone tragically wrong: shattered glass near the back door, scattered valuables on the floor, and James Carter's lifeless body sprawled in the living room. But as the investigation deepened, the facade began to crack. Detective Laura Mills, a seasoned investigator known for her sharp instincts and unrelenting pursuit of the truth, arrived at the scene early that morning. As she surveyed the room, something about the crime didn't sit right with her. The broken glass near the window seemed almost too perfect, the jagged edges scattered outward instead of inward, as if the window had been smashed from inside the house. The positioning of the valuables also felt staged, expensive items left untouched while less valuable objects were knocked over. Samantha Carter, sitting on the front steps wrapped in a police-issued blanket, recounted her version of events with trembling hands. She told the officers she had returned home to find the house in disarray and her husband unresponsive. I think someone broke in while I was gone," she stammered, her tear-streaked face a portrait of distress. Yet, to Detective Mills, her demeanor seemed oddly controlled, her sobs came at calculated moments, and her answers were rehearsed rather than spontaneous. As the forensic team analyzed the scene, more inconsistencies emerged. The trajectory of the shattered glass suggested it had been broken deliberately, and the lack of forced entry at other points in the house raised suspicions. Fingerprint analysis revealed that many of the so-called disturbed items bore only Samantha's and James's prints, suggesting they had been handled recently rather than in a panic by a burglar. Additionally, there were no muddy footprints or foreign DNA to support the presence of an intruder. While the physical evidence painted an increasingly dubious picture, Samantha's behavior during questioning drew further scrutiny. Her statements about her whereabouts that night were vague, filled with pauses and contradictions. She claimed she had dinner with a friend, but when pressed for details, she struggled to provide a name or location. Her phone records, obtained with a warrant, showed no calls or messages to support her alibi. Detective Mills's suspicions deepened when a neighbor, Mrs. Abernathy, came forward with a crucial piece of information. She reported seeing a man in dark clothing near the Carter home around midnight. At first, she had assumed it was James, but the figure's height and build didn't match. This account, combined with surveillance footage from a nearby street camera, revealed a shadowy figure entering and exiting the Carter property around the time of the murder. A turning point in the investigation came with the discovery of Samantha's secret relationship with Father David Harper. The private investigator hired by James before his death had documented Samantha's frequent visits to St. Michael's Church, including late-night meetings with Father David. Emails and text messages retrieved from Samantha's phone painted a damning picture of an affair fueled by emotional dependency and forbidden attraction. One particularly incriminating message from Father David read, "We'll find a way to be together. Trust me." As detectives dug deeper, they found further connections tying Father David to the crime. Surveillance footage from the church parking lot showed his car leaving late on the night of June 11, just hours before James was killed. Forensic evidence from the Carter home added another nail to his coffin. A partial fingerprint on the broken brass lamp matched Father David's. When confronted with the mounting evidence, Father David initially denied everything. But his composure cracked under pressure. During an intense interrogation, his story began to falter, and subtle inconsistencies in his timeline emerged. Meanwhile, Samantha's panic escalated as detectives uncovered more about her involvement. She denied knowing about the murder plot, but her digital footprint told a different story. Messages between her and Father David discussed their frustrations with James and hinted at a solution to their predicament. The community of Brentwood was in shock as news of the affair and the murder investigation spread. The once revered Father David Harper, a figure of moral authority, was now the prime suspect in a grisly crime. Parishioners who had sought his guidance struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster he had become. As the evidence piled up, Samantha and Father David found themselves backed into a corner. Detectives presented their findings: the staged break-in, the forensic matches, the damning messages, and the timeline that placed Father David at the scene of the crime. Faced with no way out, Samantha broke first. Her confession came in a torrent of tears and desperation, painting herself as a victim of manipulation. "He made me believe there was no other way," she sobbed, pointing the finger squarely at Father David as the mastermind. Father David's arrest soon followed. Shackled and led out of the church he once called home, his fall from grace was as public as it was catastrophic. The investigation, though nearly complete, left lingering questions. How much of the crime was Samantha's doing, and how much was Father David's manipulation? The answer, like the truth behind the shattered glass in the Carter home, lay somewhere in the jagged edges of their lies. As the investigation closed in on Samantha Carter and Father David Harper, the weight of their lies began to crush them. Samantha, once poised and calculated, now appeared frazzled and on edge. Every knock at the door and every ringing phone made her heart race, each sound a reminder that the web of deceit she and Father David had spun was unraveling faster than she could mend it. For Father David, the calm confidence that had once defined him had eroded into visible paranoia. He avoided the church's congregation, and his once eloquent sermons became stilted, as if the guilt he carried was choking the life out of him. The breakthrough came during an intense interrogation with Samantha. Detectives had gathered every piece of evidence: the staged break-in, the text messages between her and Father David, surveillance footage of him near the Carter residence on the night of the murder, and the partial fingerprint found on the brass lamp. When Detective Laura Mills laid the evidence out before her, Samantha's composure cracked. "This is your chance, Samantha," Detective Mills said, her tone firm but measured. "If you tell us the truth, now, everything, we can help you. But if you keep lying, this all falls squarely on you." For a moment, Samantha sat frozen, her hands clenched tightly on the table. Then, as if the dam inside her broke, she began to cry, her shoulders shaking with the weight of her confession. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't think it would actually happen." Over the next several hours, Samantha unraveled the details of the murder plot. She painted herself as a woman pushed to the brink, manipulated by a man she had trusted implicitly. "He convinced me that James was a threat," she said through tears. He said it was the only way we could be free. I didn't want this. I didn't want any of this." But Detective Mills wasn't convinced by Samantha's portrayal of innocence. While her confession revealed Father David's role as the mastermind, it also highlighted her active participation in planning the crime. "You left the door unlocked, Samantha," Mills reminded her. "You created the alibi. You let him into your home. This wasn't something that just happened to you." Meanwhile, Father David was brought in for questioning. At first, he denied everything, maintaining his innocence with the calm veneer of a man who had led a congregation for years. "I was at the church all night," he insisted, his voice steady. "I have no idea what you're talking about." But as detectives presented the mountain of evidence against him, his text messages, the surveillance footage, the fingerprint, his defenses began to crumble. Each piece of evidence chipped away at his composure until, finally, he leaned back in his chair, his head in his hands. "It wasn't supposed to end like this," he muttered, his voice barely audible. I just wanted to protect her." His partial admission sealed his fate. Detectives pieced together the timeline, how Father David had manipulated Samantha into believing James was a danger, how he had devised the staged burglary, and how he had personally carried out the murder. His calm, calculated demeanor during the planning contrasted starkly with the desperation that now radiated from him. The community of Brentwood was rocked by the revelations. The news of Father David's affair with Samantha had already spread like wildfire, but the revelation that he was directly involved in James Carter's murder was a betrayal that left parishioners reeling. People who had once sought his guidance now questioned every sermon, every prayer, every moment of trust they had placed in him. When the time came for Samantha and Father David to face each other, their carefully constructed alliance shattered. During her formal confession, Samantha placed the blame squarely on Father David. "He orchestrated everything," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I was scared. I didn't know what else to do." Father David, brought into the room later for his statement, reacted with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Scared?" he spat, his calm demeanor evaporating. "You were a willing participant, Samantha. Don't pretend you didn't know exactly what you were doing." Their mutual accusations created a dramatic spectacle in the interrogation room, each trying to absolve themselves by condemning the other. But for the detectives, the truth was clear: both had played pivotal roles in the crime, and both would face justice. As the confessions were finalized, the enormity of what they had done finally seemed to dawn on Samantha and Father David. Samantha's tears, once a weapon of manipulation, now carried genuine regret. Father David, once a figure of strength and morality, looked defeated, his hands shaking as he signed his statement. When the arrests were made public, the media descended on Brentwood, turning the case into a nationwide spectacle. Reporters camped outside the church, desperate for sound bites and interviews. Parishioners gathered in disbelief, their faith in Father David shattered. The collapse of Samantha Carter and Father David Harper was complete. They had built their relationship on lies and betrayal, and now those same lies had destroyed them. As they were led away in handcuffs, neither could bring themselves to look at the other. Their story, once cloaked in secrecy, had become a cautionary tale of manipulation, obsession, and the devastating consequences of unchecked desire. By December 2022, the Carter murder case had become a nationwide spectacle. Reporters swarmed the courthouse in Nashville, Tennessee, eager to cover every lurid detail of the trial that had captivated the public. The story of Samantha Carter and Father David Harper, an illicit affair turned deadly, was one of betrayal, manipulation, and moral collapse. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with tension as the prosecution and defense prepared to argue their cases before a packed gallery. The prosecution, led by the relentless District Attorney Margaret Calloway, laid out a compelling narrative of premeditated murder. Over the course of several weeks, Calloway meticulously presented the evidence: the staged break-in, the damning text messages and emails exchanged between Samantha and Father David, and forensic proof tying Father David to the crime scene. The prosecution painted Samantha and Father David as co-conspirators, bound by their forbidden relationship and shared desperation to remove James Carter from their lives. Key witnesses took the stand, each adding another layer to the damning case. A forensic analyst explained how the shattered glass at the Carter home indicated an inside job. Surveillance footage showed Father David's car leaving St. Michael's Church on the night of the murder and returning hours later. Perhaps most damaging were the testimonies from Samantha's and Father David's acquaintances, who revealed how their relationship had grown increasingly inappropriate in the months leading up to James's death. Samantha Carter was not an innocent victim, Calloway argued in her opening statement. She willingly participated in a cold, calculated plot to murder her husband, motivated by her affair with Father David Harper. Together, they planned this crime and carried it out with chilling precision. The defense, however, sought to shift the blame. Samantha's attorney, a seasoned litigator named Peter Gaines, portrayed her as a woman trapped in an emotionally abusive marriage, vulnerable to the manipulations of a man she trusted. Samantha was desperate and isolated, Gaines argued. She sought solace in her faith and fell victim to the influence of a man who used his position of power to exploit her vulnerability. In contrast, Father David's attorney, Simon Wallace, attempted to cast doubt on the extent of his involvement. Father Harper's actions were misguided, but he was not the mastermind of this tragedy, Wallace claimed. He was drawn into Samantha's web of lies and deceit, blinded by emotions he could not control. The trial's most dramatic moments came when Samantha and Father David took the stand. Samantha, visibly shaken and tearful, recounted her version of events, claiming she had been manipulated by Father David into believing there was no other way out of her unhappy marriage. "I trusted him," she said, her voice cracking. "He made me believe that James was a danger to me, to us. I didn't know what else to do." When Father David testified, his once calm and commanding demeanor was gone, replaced by a man grappling with his fall from grace. He admitted to the affair and to his role in staging the crime but denied orchestrating the murder. "I never wanted anyone to die," he said. "I thought I was protecting Samantha." The prosecution countered both testimonies with cold, hard evidence, the timeline of their communication, the detailed planning in their messages, and the forensic proof linking Father David to the weapon. This was not a crime of passion, Calloway emphasized in her closing arguments. This was a premeditated murder, planned over weeks and executed with chilling intent. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. On December 20, 2022, Samantha Carter was found guilty of second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Her cooperation with investigators and expressions of remorse led to a reduced sentence of 15 years in prison. Father David Harper, however, faced the full weight of the law. Convicted of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read, the severity of his punishment reflecting both the heinous nature of his crimes and the profound breach of trust he had committed as a spiritual leader. As Samantha and Father David were escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the gallery buzzed with murmurs of disbelief and relief. For the Carter family's friends and loved ones, the verdicts brought a sense of closure, though the scars left by James's death would remain. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements, but none came. Samantha avoided the cameras, her head bowed, while Father David stared straight ahead, his once revered image now irreparably tarnished. The trial had reached its conclusion, but the aftermath lingered. The community of Brentwood struggled to come to terms with the betrayal of a trusted priest and the disintegration of a seemingly perfect family. The case served as a grim reminder of how unchecked desires and hidden secrets could unravel lives, leaving devastation in their wake. For Samantha and Father David, their sentences marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a lifetime spent grappling with the choices that had led them down such a dark and irreversible path. As the courtroom emptied and the echoes of the verdict faded, the story of James Carter's murder left an indelible mark on the lives of everyone involved. Samantha Carter and Father David Harper, once bound by a dangerous and forbidden relationship, now faced the consequences of their actions in the cold confines of prison cells. For them, freedom was no longer a reality, only time remained, stretching endlessly as they grappled with their guilt and the lives they had destroyed. In Brentwood, the aftermath of the trial rippled through the small, tight-knit community. At St. Michael's Church, parishioners found themselves adrift without the spiritual leader they had once revered. The sanctuary, once a place of solace and trust, now felt hollow. The knowledge that Father David had exploited his position for his own desires left many questioning their faith, not in God, but in the fallibility of the people they had trusted most. For the Carter family, the void left by James's death was insurmountable. Friends and relatives struggled to reconcile the image of Samantha, the devoted wife and mother they thought they knew, with the reality of her role in the crime. James's parents, devastated by the loss of their son, chose to leave Brentwood altogether, unable to bear the memories of a town that had once been their haven. Samantha's children, now in the care of extended family, grew up carrying the weight of their parents' decisions. The whispers that followed them in school hallways and public spaces were unavoidable, a cruel reminder of a legacy they never asked for. Samantha's attempts to reach out from prison were met with silence, her letters unanswered. Her greatest punishment, perhaps, was not the years she faced behind bars but the permanent severing of the bonds she had once held most dear. Father David, meanwhile, faced his own reckoning. Stripped of his clerical title, he became a symbol of betrayal and moral failure. In prison, he spent his days in isolation, no longer the man who had commanded a congregation's trust. For someone who had once been seen as a guide to others, the silence of his new life was deafening. Despite occasional attempts to justify his actions to himself, the memory of James's lifeless body and the betrayal of his vows haunted him. For the residents of Brentwood, the case served as a grim reminder that even the most idyllic lives could conceal darkness. The scandal became a cautionary tale, discussed in hushed tones at dinner tables and community events. Many wondered how things could have been different, what signs they might have missed, or what could have been done to prevent such a tragic outcome. Yet, amidst the pain and loss, the case also prompted deeper conversations. It forced people to confront the dangers of unchecked ambition, the vulnerabilities that can lead people down dangerous paths, and the importance of communication in relationships. It highlighted how loneliness and dissatisfaction, left unaddressed, could fester into something far more destructive. As time passed, the events faded from the national spotlight, but for those closest to the tragedy, the scars remained. Samantha and Father David would live out their days reflecting on the choices that led them to ruin. For the Carter family, healing seemed an impossible dream. And for the town of Brentwood, the story became a dark chapter in its history, a stark contrast to the community's serene, picture-perfect facade. What do you think about this haunting story of betrayal, manipulation, and moral collapse? Could this tragedy have been prevented if Samantha and Father David had made different choices? Who do you think bears the greatest responsibility for James Carter's death? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were captivated by this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories that delve into the hidden motives and chilling twists behind real-life events. Your engagement helps us uncover and share these compelling tales.